Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with some more freedom. Today we are going to be continuing our energetic investment into the future of our union by studying its past, by talking more about the Federalist Papers, reading them aloud, and discussing them briefly. We will be dealing with the Federalist Paper number 75, 76, and 77, wrapping up the powers of the executive. Uh, and so let's just dig in. Federalist Paper number 75, The Treaty Making Power of the Executive, for the Independent Journal, authored by Alexander Hamilton, to the people of the state of New York. The President is to have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. Though this provision has been assailed on different grounds with no small degree of vehemence, I scruple not to declare my firm persuasion that it is one of the best digested and most unexceptionable parts of the plan. One ground of objection is the trite topic of the intermixture of powers, some contending that the President ought to alone to possess the power of making treaties, others that it ought to have been exclusively deposited in the Senate. Another source of objection is derived from the small number of persons by whom a treaty may be made. Of those who espouse this objection, a part of opinion that the House of Representatives ought to have been associated in the business, while another part seems to think nothing more was necessary than to have substituted two-thirds of all the members of the Senate to two-thirds of the members present. As I flatter myself, the observations made in the preceding number upon this part of the plan must have sufficed to place it to a discerning eye in a very favorable light. I am here to content myself with offering only some supplementary remarks, principally with a view to the objections which have just been stated. With regard to the intermixture of powers, I shall rely upon the explanations already given in other places of the true sense of the rule upon which that objection is founded, and shall take it for granted, as an inference from them, that the union of the executive with the Senate in the article of treaties is no infringement of that rule. I venture to add that the particular nature of the power of making treaties indicates a peculiar propriety in that union. Though several writers on the subject of government place that power in the class of executive authorities, yet this is evidently an arbitrary disposition. For if we attend carefully to its operation, it will be found to partake more of the legislative than of the executive character, though it does not seem to strictly to fall within the definition of either of them. The essence of the legislative authority is to enact laws, or, in other words, to prescribe rules for the regulation of the society, while the execution of the laws and the empowerment of the common strength, either for this purpose or for the common defense, seem to comprise all the functions of the executive magistrate. The power of making treaties is, plainly, neither the one nor the other. It relates neither to the execution of the subsisting laws, nor to the enaction of new ones, and still less to an exertion of the common strength. Its objects are contracts with foreign nations, which have the force of law, but derive it from the obligations of good faith. They are not rules prescribed by the sovereign to the subject, but agreements between sovereign and sovereign. The power in question seems therefore to form a distinct department, and to belong properly neither to the legislative nor to the executive. The qualities elsewhere detailed as indispensable in the management of foreign negotiations point out the executive as the most fit agent in those transactions, while the vast importance of the trust and the operation of treaties as laws plead strongly for the participation of the whole or a portion of the legislative body in the office of making them. However proper or safe it may be in governments where the executive magistrate is a hereditary monarch, to commit to him the entire power of making treaties, it would be utterly unsafe and improper to entrust that power to an elective magistrate of 4 years' duration. It has been remarked, upon another occasion, and the remark is unquestionably just, that a hereditary monarch, though often the oppressor of his people, has personally too much at stake in the government to be in any material danger of being corrupted by foreign powers. But a man raised from the station of private citizen to the rank of chief magistrate, possessed of a moderate or slender fortune, and looking forward to a period not very remote when he may probably be obliged to return to the station from which he was taken, might sometimes be under temptations to sacrifice his duty to his interest, which it would require a superlative virtue to withstand. An avaricious man might be tempted to betray the interest of the state to the acquisition of wealth. An ambitious man might make his own aggrandizement, by the aid of a foreign power, the price of his treachery to his constituents. The history of human conduct does not warrant that exalted opinion of human virtue which would make it wise in a nation to commit interest of so delicate and momentous a kind as those which concern its intercourse with the rest of the world, to the sole disposal of a magistrate, created and circumstanced as would be a President of the United States. To have entrusted the power of making treaties to the Senate alone would have been to relinquish the benefits of the constitutional agency of the President in the conduct of foreign negotiations. It is true that the Senate would, in that case, have the option of employing him in this capacity, but they would also have the option of letting it alone, and pique or cabal might induce the latter rather than the former. Besides this, the ministerial servant of the Senate could not be expected to enjoy the confidence and respect of foreign powers in the same degree with the constitutional representatives of the nation, and of course would not be able to act with an equal degree of weight or efficacy, while the Union would, from this cause, lose a considerable advantage in the management of its external concerns. The people would lose the additional security which would result from the cooperation of the executive. Though it would be imprudent to confide in him solely so important a trust, yet it cannot be doubted that his participation would materially aid to the safety of the society. It must, indeed, be clear to a demonstration that the joint possession of the power in question by the President and Senate would afford a greater prospect of security than the separate possession of it by either of them. And whoever has maturely weighed the circumstances which must concur in the appointment of a President will be satisfied that the office will always bid fair to be filled by men of such characters as to render their concurrence in the formation of treaties peculiarly desirable. Still don't have that word down. As well as on the score of wisdom, as on that of integrity. The remarks made in a former number, which have been alluded to in another part of this paper, will apply with conclusive force against the admission of the House of Representatives to a share in the formation of treaties. The fluctuating and taking its future increase into the account, the multitudinous composition of that body forbid us to expect it in those qualities which are essential to the proper execution of such a trust. Accurate and comprehensive knowledge of foreign politics, a steady and systemic adherence to the same views, a nice and uniform sensibility to national character, decision, secrecy, and dispatch are incompatible with the genius of a body so variable and so numerous. The very complication of the business by introducing the necessity of the concurrence of so many different bodies would of itself afford a solid objection. The greater frequency of the call upon the House of Representatives and the greater length of time which it would often be necessary to keep them together when convened, to obtain their sanction in the progressive stages of a treaty, would be the source of so great inconvenience and expense as alone ought to condemn the project. The only objection which remains to be canvassed is that which would substitute the proportion of 2/3 of all the members composing the senatorial body to that of 2/3 of the members present. It has been shown, under the second head of our inquiries, that all provisions which require more than the majority of any body to its resolutions have a direct tendency to embarrass the operations of the government, and an indirect one to subject the sense of the majority to that minority. This consideration seems sufficient to determine our opinion that the convention have gone as far in the endeavor to secure the advantage of numbers in the formation of treaties as could have been reconciled either with the activity of the public councils or with a reasonable regard to the major sense of the community. If two-thirds of the whole number of members had been required, it would, in many cases, from the non-attendance of a part, amount in practice to a necessity of unanimity. And the history of every political establishment in which this principle has prevailed is a history of impotence, perplexity, and disorder. Proofs of this position might be adduced from the examples of the Roman tribuneship, the Polish Diet, and the States General of the Netherlands. Did not an example at home render foreign precedents unnecessary? To require a fixed proportion of the whole body would not, in all probability, contribute to the advantages of a numerous agency. Better then merely to require a proportion of the attending members. The former, by making a determinate number at all times requisite to a resolution, diminishes the motives to punctual attendance. The latter, by making the capacity of the body to depend on a proportion which may be varied by the absence or presence of a single member, has the contrary effect, and as, by promoting punctuality, it tends to keep the body complete, there is a great likelihood that its resolutions would generally be dictated by as great a number in this case as in the other, while there would be much fewer occasions of delay. It ought not to be forgotten that under the existing confederation, 2 members may, and usually do, represent a state, whence it happens that Congress, who are now solely invested with all the powers of the Union, rarely consist of a greater number of persons than would compose the intended Senate. If we add to this that the members vote by states, and that where there is only a single member present from a state, his vote is lost, it will justify a supposition that the active voices in the Senate, where the members are to vote individually, would rarely fall short in number of the active voices in the existing Congress. When, in addition to these considerations, we take into view the cooperation of the President, we shall not hesitate to infer that the people of America would have greater security against an improper use of the power of making treaties under the new Constitution than they now enjoy under the Confederation. And when we proceed still one step further and look forward to the probable augmentation of the Senate by the erection of the new states, we shall not only perceive ample grounds of confidence in the sufficiency of the members to whom the agency of the power will be entrusted, but we shall probably be led to conclude that a body more numerous than the Senate would be likely to become would be very little fit for the proper discharge of the trust. And so ends Federalist Paper number 75. And most of this has already been discussed previously while we were talking about the treaties and dealing with the Senate. The executive is the main negotiating head, right? Together with 2/3 of the Senate, any treaty can be formed, but without both of them, nothing can be done. So people who are freaking out about a day that is really soon need to keep in mind that the Senate have signed nothing. There's not a whole lot to add here, right? Keeping it down to the members present is supposed to encourage attendance, and for the most part it does, because if the other side shows up more than your side, then you get overridden, so you better show up. Now we're going to be talking about Federalist Paper number 76, the appointing power of the executive, from the New York Packet, Tuesday, April the 1st of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton, to the people of the state of New York. The President is to nominate and, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not otherwise provided for in the Constitution. But the Congress may, by law, vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, or in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. The President shall have the power to fill up all vacancies which may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. It has been observed in a former paper that the true test of a good government is its aptitude and tendency to produce a good administration. If the justness of this observation be admitted, The mode of appointing the officers of the United States contained in the foregoing clauses must, when examined, be allowed to be entitled to particular commendation. It is not easy to conceive a plan better calculated than this to promote a judicious choice of men for filling the offices of the Union, and it will not need proof that on this point must essentially depend the character of its administration. It will be agreed on all hands that the power of appointment, in ordinary cases, ought to be modified in one of three ways. It ought either to be vested in a single man, or in a select assembly of a moderate number, or in a single man with the concurrence of such an assembly. The exercise of it by the people at large will be readily admitted to be impracticable, as waiving every other consideration, it would leave them little time to do anything else. When, therefore, mention is made in the subsequent reasoning of an assembly or body of men, what is said must be understood to relate to a select body or assembly, of the description already given. The people, collectively, from their number and from their dispersed situation, cannot be regulated in their movements by that systemic spirit of cabal and intrigue, which will be urged as the chief objection to reposing the power in question in a body of men. Those who have themselves reflected upon the subject, or who have attended to the observations made in other parts of these papers, in relation to the appointment of the President, will, I presume, agree to the position that there would always be great probability of having the place supplied by a man of ability, at least respectable. Premising this, I proceed to lay it down as a rule that one man of discernment is better fitted to analyze and estimate the peculiar qualities adapted to particular offices than a body of men of equal and perhaps even of superior discernment. The sole and undivided responsibility of one man will naturally beget a livelier sense of duty and more exact regard to reputation. He will, on this account, feel himself under stronger obligations, and more interested to investigate with care the qualities requisite to the stations to be filled, and to prefer with impartiality the persons who may have the fairest pretensions to them. He will have fewer personal attachments to gratify than a body of men who may be each be supposed to have an equal number, and will be so much the less liable to be misled by the sentiments of friendship and of affection. A single, well-directed man, by a single understanding, cannot be distracted or warped by that diversity of views, feelings, and interests which frequently distract and warp the resolutions of a collective body. There is nothing so apt to agitate the passions of mankind as personal considerations, whether they relate to ourselves or to others, who are to be the objects of our choice or preference. Hence, in every exercise of the power of appointing to offices by an assembly of men, we must expect to see a full display of all the private and party likings and dislikes, partialities and antipathies, attachments and animosities which are felt by those who compose the assembly. The choice which may at any time happen to be made under such circumstances will, of course, be the result of either a victory gained by one party over the other, or of a compromise between the parties. In either case, the intrinsic merit of the candidate will be too often out of sight. In the first, the qualifications best adapted to unifying the suffrages of the party will be more considered than those which fit the person for the station. In the last, the coalition will commonly turn upon some interested equivalent. Give us the man we wish for this office, and you shall have the one you wish for that. This will be the usual condition of the bargain, and it will rarely happen that the advancement of the public service will be the primary object of either party victories or of party negotiations. The truth of the principles here advanced seem to have been felt by the most intelligent of those who have found fault with the provision made, in this respect, by the convention. They contend that the President ought solely to have been authorized to make the appointments under the federal government. But it is easy to show that every advantage to be expected from such an arrangement would, in substance, be derived from the power of nomination, which is proposed to be conferred upon him, while several disadvantages which might attend the absolute power of appointment in the hands of that officer would be avoided. In the act of nomination, his judgment alone would be exercised, and it would be his sole duty to point out the man who, with the approbation of the Senate, should fill an office. His responsibility would be as complete as if he were to make the final appointment. There can, in this view, be no difference between nominating and appointing. The same motives which would influence a proper discharge of his duty in one case would exist in the other, and as no man could be appointed but on his previous nomination, every man who might be appointed would be, in fact, his choice. But might not his nomination be overruled? I grant it might, yet this could only be to make place for another nomination by himself. The person ultimately appointed must be the object of his preference, though perhaps not in the first degree. It is also not very probable that his nomination would often be overruled. The Senate cannot be tempted, by the preference they might feel to another, to reject the one proposed because they could not assure themselves that the person they might wish would be brought forward by a second or by any subsequent nomination. They could not even be certain that a future nomination would present a candidate in any degree more acceptable to them, and as their dissent might cast a kind of stigma upon the individual rejected, and might have the appearance of a reflection upon the judgment of the chief magistrate, it is not unlikely that their sanction would often be refused, where there were not special and strong reasons for the refusal. To what purpose, then, require the cooperation of the Senate? I answer that the necessity of their concurrence would have a powerful, though in general a silent operation. It would be an excellent check upon a spirit of favoritism in the President, and would tend greatly to prevent the appointment of unfit characters from state prejudice, from family connection, from personal attachment, or from a view to popularity. In addition to this, it would be an efficacious source of stability in the administration. It will readily be comprehended that a man who had himself the sole disposition of offices would be governed much more by his private inclinations and interests than when he was bound to submit to the propriety of his choice to the discussion and determination of a different and independent body, and that body of an entire branch of the legislature. The possibility of rejection would be a strong motive to care in proposing. The danger to his own reputation, and in the case of an elective magistrate to his political existence, from betraying a spirit of favoritism or an unbecoming pursuit of popularity, to the observation of a body whose opinion would have greater weight in forming that of the public, could not fail to operate as a barrier to the one and to the other. He would be both ashamed and afraid to bring forward, for the most distinguished or lucrative stations, candidates who had no other merit than that of coming from the same state to which he particularly belonged, or of being in some way or other personally allied to him, or of possessing the necessary insignificance and pliancy to render them the obsequious instruments to his pleasure. To this reasoning it has been objected that the President, by the influence of the power of nomination, may secure the complaisance of the Senate to his views. This supposition of universal venality in human nature is little less an error in political reasoning than the supposition of universal rectitude. The institution of delegated power implies that there is a portion of virtue and honor among mankind, which may be a reasonable foundation of confidence, and experience justifies the theory. It has been found to exist in the most corrupt periods of the most corrupt governments. The venality of the British House of Commons has long been a topic of accusation against that body, in the country to which they belong as well as in this, and it cannot be doubted that the charge is, to a considerable extent, well founded. But it is as little to be doubted that there was always a large proportion of the body which consists of independent and public-spirited men, who have an influential weight in the councils of the nation. Hence it is, the present reign not excepted, that the sense of that body is often seen to control the inclinations of the monarch, both with regard to men and to measures. Though it might therefore be allowable to suppose that the executive might occasionally influence some individuals in the Senate, yet the supposition that he could in general purchase the integrity of the whole body would be forced and improbable. A man disposed to view human nature as it is, without either flattering its virtues or exaggerating its vices, will see sufficient ground of confidence in the probity of the Senate to rest satisfied not only that it will be impracticable to the executive to corrupt or seduce a majority of its members, but that the necessity of its cooperation in the business of appointments will be a considerable and salutary restraint upon the conduct of that magistrate. Nor is the integrity of the Senate the only reliance. The Constitution has provided some important guards against the danger of executive influence upon the legislative body. It declares that no senator or representative shall, during the time for which he was elected, be appointed to any civil office under the United States which shall have been created, or the emoluments whereof shall have been increased, during such time, and no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during his continuance in office. And so ends Federalist Paper number 76. And here we really had a discussion about why you don't put too much power into one man, right? If you put the president in place and give him unlimited power to appoint anybody that he wants, then he's going to fill himself up with cronies. The check of going to the Senate is to at least make sure that they are somewhat qualified for the position they're being put in. Because, I mean, what would the world be if you put somebody that could not decide that they were the correct thing in the charge of one of the branches of the military? That would be a travesty, right? If you put somebody who is mentally incompetent in charge of a department, that would be a problem, right? Well, that's the point of having the Senate, because they are supposed to be the check against that. Somehow, some way, the legislature has seen fit to allow some of the things to be slid underneath that probably should have been underneath the scope of the Senate, because the legislature, not the Senate, but the legislature has the power to say, no, this particular office, you don't have to get confirmed. And so we wind up with somebody that doesn't know which uniform to wear in charge of a branch of the military. The Senate is to be the check against the executive, and the executive is the check against the Senate. And that's why they are to work in concert for treaties, and they are to work somewhat in concert for this. It is supposed to be the president's nomination. Regardless of who it winds up being, it comes from the executive nomination. That was the point of 76. Now we're going to get into Federalist Paper number 77. The appointing power continued and other powers of the executive considered. From the New York Packet, Friday, April 4th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. It has been mentioned as one of the advantages to be expected from the cooperation of the Senate in the business of appointments that it would contribute to the stability of the administration. The consent of that body would be necessary to displace as well as to appoint. A change of the chief magistrate, therefore, would not occasion so violent or so general a revolution in the officers of the government as might be expected, if he were the sole disposer of offices. Where a man in any station had given satisfactory evidence for his fitness for it, a new president would be restrained from attempting to change in favor of a person more agreeable to him, by the apprehension that a discountenance by the Senate might frustrate the attempt, and bring some degree of discredit upon himself. Those who can best estimate the value of a steady administration will be most disposed to apprize a provision which connects the official existence of public men with the approbation or disapprobation of that body which, from the greater permanency of its own composition, will, in all probability, be less subject to the inconstancy than any other member of government. The origin of the deep state, people. To this union of the Senate with the President, in the article of appointments, it has in some cases been suggested that it would serve to give the President an undue influence over the Senate, and in others that it would have an opposite tendency, a strong proof that neither suggestion is true. To state the first in its proper form is to refute it. It amounts to this: the President would have an improper influence over the Senate because the Senate would have the power of restraining him. This is an absurdity in terms. It cannot admit of a doubt that the entire power of appointment would enable him much more effectually to establish a dangerous empire over that body than a mere power of nomination subject to their control. Let us take a view of the converse of this proposition. The Senate would influence the executive, as I have had occasion to remark in several other instances. The indistinctness of the objection forbids a precise answer. In what manner is this influence to be exerted? In relation to what objects? The power of influencing person, in the sense in which it is here used, must imply a power of conferring a benefit upon him. How could the Senate confer a benefit upon the President by the manner of employing their right of negative upon his nominations? If it be said that they might sometimes gratify him by acquiescence in a favorite choice, when public motives might dictate a different conduct, I answer that the instances in which the President could be personally interested in the result would be too few to admit of his being materially affected by the compliances of the Senate. The power which can originate the disposition of honors and emoluments is more likely to attract than to be attracted by the powers which can merely obstruct their course. If by influencing the President be meant restraining him, this is precisely what must have been intended, and it has been shown that the restraint would be salutary, and at the same time that it would not be such as to destroy a single advantage to be looked for from the uncontrolled agency of that magistrate. The right of nomination would produce all the good of that appointment, and would, in a great measure, avoid its evils. Upon a comparison of the plan for the appointment of the officers of the proposed government with that which is established by the Constitution of this state, a decided preference would be given to necessity for submitting each nomination to the judgment of an entire branch of the legislature. The circumstances attending to an appointment, from the mode of conducting it, would naturally become matters of notoriety, and the public would be at no loss to determine what part had been performed by the different actors. The blame of a bad nomination would fall upon the President singly and absolutely. The censure of rejecting a good one would lie entirely at the door of the Senate, aggravated by the consideration of their having counteracted the good intentions of the executive. If an ill appointment should be made, the executive for nominating and the Senate for approving would participate, though in different degrees, in the opprobrium and disgrace. The reverse of all this characterizes the manner of appointment in this state. The council of appointment consists of from 3 to 5 persons, of whom the governor is always one. This small body, shut up in a private apartment, impenetrable to the public eye, proceed to the execution of the trusts committed to them. It is known that the governor claims the right of nomination, upon the strength of some ambiguous expressions in the Constitution, but it is not known to what extent or in what manner he exercises it, nor upon what occasions he is contradicted or opposed. The censure of a bad appointment, on account of the uncertainty of its author and for want of a determinate object, has neither poignancy nor duration, and while an unbounded field for cabal and intrigue lies open, all idea of responsibility is lost. The most that the public can know is that the governor claims the right of the nomination, that 2 out of the inconsiderable number of 4 men can too often be managed without too much difficulty, that if some of the members of a particular council should happen to be of an uncomplying nature, it is frequently not impossible to get rid of their opposition by regulating the times of meeting in such a manner as to render their attendance inconvenient, and that from whatever cause it may proceed, a great number of very improper appointments are from time to time made. Whether a governor of this state avails himself to the ascendant, he must necessarily have, in this delicate and important part of the administration, to prefer to offices men who are best qualified for them, or whether he prostitutes that advantage to the advancement of persons whose chief merit is their implicit devotion to his will, and to the support of a despicable and dangerous system of personal influence, are questions which, unfortunately for the community, can only be the subjects of speculation and conjecture. Every mere council of appointment, however constituted, will be a conclave, in which cabal and intrigue will have their full scope. Their number, without an unwarrantable increase of expense, cannot be large enough to preclude a facility of combination. And as each member will have his friends and connections to provide for, the desire of mutual gratification will beget a scandalous bartering of votes and bargaining for places. The private attachments of one man might easily be satisfied, but to satisfy the private attachments of a dozen or of 20 men would occasion a monopoly of all the principal employments of the government in a few families, and would lead more directly to an aristocracy or an oligarchy than any measure which could be contrived. If, to avoid an accumulation of offices, there was to be a frequent change in the persons who were to compose the council, this would involve the mischiefs of a mutable administration in their full extent. Such a council would be more liable to executive influence than the Senate, because they would be fewer in number and would act less immediately under public inspection. Such a council, in fine, as a substitute for the plan of the convention, would be productive of an increase in expense, a multiplication of the evils from which spring from favoritism and intrigue in the distribution of public honors, a decrease of stability in the administration of the government, and a diminution of the security against an undue influence of the executive. And yet such a council has been warmly contended for as an essential amendment in the proposed Constitution. I could not, with propriety, conclude my observations of the subject of appointments without taking a notice of a scheme for which there have appeared some, though few, advocates. I mean that of uniting the House of Representatives in the power of making them. I shall, however, do little more than mention it, as I cannot imagine that it is likely to gain the countenance of any considerable part of the community. A body so fluctuating, and at the same time so numerous, cannot be deemed proper for the exercise of that power. Its unfitness will appear manifest to all, when it is recollected that in half a century it may consist of 300 or 400 persons. All the advantages of the stability, both of the executive and of the Senate, would be defeated by this union, and infinite delays and embarrassments would be occasioned. The example of most of the states in their local constitutions encourages us to reprobate the idea. The only remaining powers of the executive are comprehended in giving information to Congress of the state of the Union, in recommending to their consideration such measures as he shall judge expedient, in convening them, or either branch, upon extraordinary occasions, and adjourning them, when they cannot themselves agree upon the time of adjournment, in receiving ambassadors and other public ministers, in faithfully executing the laws, and in commissioning all the officers of the United States. Except some cavils about the power of convening either house of the legislature and that of receiving ambassadors, no objection has been made to this class of authorities, nor could they possibly admit of any. It required, indeed, an insatiable avidity for censure to invent exceptions to the parts which have been accepted too. In regard to the power of convening either house of legislature, I shall barely remark that in respect to the Senate at least we can readily discover a good reason for it. As this body has a concurrent power with the executive in the article of treaties, it might often be necessary to call together with a view to this object, when it would be unnecessary and improper to convene the House of Representatives. As to the reception of the ambassadors, what I have said in the former paper will furnish a sufficient answer. We have now completed a survey of the structure and powers of the executive department, which, I have endeavored to show, combines, as far as republican principles will admit, all the requisites to energy. The remaining inquiry is, does it also combine the requisites to safety, in a republican sense, a due dependence on the people, a due responsibility? The answer to this question has been anticipated in the investigation of its other characteristics, and is satisfactorily deducible from these circumstances. From the election of the President once in 4 years by persons immediately chosen by the people for that purpose, and from his being at all times liable to impeachment, trial, dismission from office, incapacity to serve in any other, and a forfeit of life and estate by subsequent prosecution in the common course of law. But these precautions, great as they are not the only ones which the plan of the convention has provided in favor of the public security. In the only instances in which the abuse of the executive authority was materially to be feared, the Chief Magistrate of the United States would, by that plan, be subjected to the control of a branch of the legislative body. What more could be desired by an enlightened and reasonable people? And so ends Federalist Paper number 77. And that's where we're going to wrap this one up, because next begins the judiciary, and we're going to keep those separate. This was a reiteration of 76 more than anything. It was just saying, again, it is not wise to invest too much power into one person, but that sometimes you do need one person to be in charge of things. Sometimes you need that one dude that can make the decision. Sometimes you need the guy that can meet somebody and shake their hand, the one who can fly somewheres and meet somebody. It's hard to do that with a whole Senate. It's hard to do that, especially with a legislature. And you want to concentrate the power in one man as little as possible. The points that have to be concentrated there, you concentrate there, but you put checks against him in other places. And that's basically what's been outlined here. There's not a whole lot for me to extrapolate on and drag it out. I'm reading this into the record. I believe that by reading this aloud and by you listening to it, we are investing our energy into our union. We are becoming more the perfect union that we should have been and never have. We are seeking and striving to fulfill the ideals laid out here, and the ideals always come back to be informed. The link will be provided down below if you want to go back and read this. Some people do, some people don't, and that's perfectly fine. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a not too difficult topic. This to me is self-evident as I read through it. Some people may have to kick it back a couple times and reread and try and figure it out, and that's okay too. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are, and this has been Pit Steak. Peace.